All right, class, I think we can get started. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Finally, spring has sprung, right? Thank you. So, before we get into introducing the speaker, just in terms of housekeeping announcements, there is a final paper due. Since we have one more seminar, that portal is now open on Canvas. So just please pay attention to that. The guidelines is outlined in the syllabus. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any one of the instructors. So it is my distinct honor again today to introduce two excellent speakers who are coming from within Cornell University. So I'll keep the introductions very, very short, so you can hear more from them than from me. So first we have Mario Herrero, leading global expert in sustainable food systems, who is currently professor in global development, my department. And Mario has one of the most highly cited researchers among the top 10 Reuters scientists cited for climate change. He focuses on food systems, sustainability, climate change adaptation, livestock systems, and sustainable diets. He's co-authored many high-ranking reports and was last year elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Also in his working with Mario and partner in crime, working from the same lab, is Mario Manson de Cross. Yes. I was trying to pronounce Daniel Manson de Cross. Sorry. And he is senior research associate in global development, working on healthy food systems with a background in development economics and experience also in Peace Corps volunteer. His research addresses the impacts of climate change, diet-related health and environmental outcomes, and food system vulnerabilities. There's much more to say about both of these authors, but today they're going to be sharing with us really fresh out of the press, the findings from the EAT-Lancet to report healthy diets for sustainable food systems for all. Please help me welcome Mario and Daniel. Over to you, gentlemen.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to listen to us. Thanks for the kind introduction. Ed. Yeah, so what we're going to present today is a little bit about a report that will be launched in October. And it's the follow-up to the first EAT-Lancet report, which was a really, really influential report that came in 2019, that tried to answer the question, well, how can we feed sustainably 10 billion people and within planetary boundaries? You know, the original report and this one share some commonalities, and one of them is primarily, you know, we are not making inroads in changing these kind of figures that you see here, where everything's accelerating, everything's increasing, you know, from obesity to overweight, emissions in agriculture, we use more pesticides, and you know, this is really a very, very wicked problem that involves many sectors, and it's something that we will need to attack from not only from a supply side, as we traditionally do in agriculture, well, you know, trying to intensify, trying to use less land, etc. But also we'll need to deal with food waste, we'll need to deal with diets and a range of other factors. The fact remains that, you know, just look at the scale of the challenge. You know, some time ago, we, you know, take the 70s. We were always worried about undernutrition. That was the key problem. But because of a very significant nutrition transition, because of low prices of food, because the increase in ultra-processed foods, we now have a lot of people, 2 billion people that are adult or obese. Now we have more people with problems of overnutrition than people dealing with undernutrition. And at the same time, we have a lot of people lacking micronutrients and vitamins and so on. So this is really, really something that, just imagine the costs that this generates for the health system. Just imagine how much we're eroding our ecosystems. and so on. So we need to actually try to reverse this path. So the EAT-Lancet series of reports, this is the second one, is divided into 5 themes. One is on justice in food systems, because these problems are not affecting everybody equally. And at the end of the day, we need to ensure that, for example, we have affordable diets for everybody, both for the rich and for the poor, that we have access to healthy food for both the rich and the poor, for women, for men, etc. And, you know, this concept of justice, although implicit in many of the actions, we need to make it way more explicit in the way that we deal with the food system, because we need specific policies that will deal with these inequalities that we observe. Then, as in the first report, we were focusing on healthy diets, and in this case, we reviewed the evidence on diet and nutrition and tried to come up with regionally appropriate diets that would be healthy for human consumption. And the key here was that these were diets where we tried to reduce the risk of non-communicable diseases. That's a key consideration. Then we dealt with the planetary boundaries, with the food systems boundaries. So we tried to identify thresholds for these boundaries and what would be the contribution of the food system. And then we tested a range of scenarios. We had a food systems modeling ensemble, very expertly led by Daniel. Daniel helped coordinate all this work on behalf of the global community of modelers, trying to test how these different pathways, how we could tweak the system a little bit in order to get healthy food, healthy environment, and you know, and a just food system as well. So let's start with the planetary health diet. Many of you have seen this diagram, and I see some faces here that might have been exposed to this figure. The planetary health diet is in terms of a concept, it's something that you all know and you've seen before. You know, take that plate, make the vegetables the star of the plate. That's the basic consideration. You know, a few years ago, this would have been, you know, massive steak, a tomahawk in the middle, you know, with a few veggies. No, let's switch it around. It's really about consuming mostly a plant-based diet with lots of colors, some good amount of whole grains, and some discretionary animal source foods, which are super important because they have a huge nutrient density. But let's transition towards that kind of information. And this is really important because, you know, this is really about, you know, ensuring that we have good health outcomes. It's a whole spectrum of nutrients that we want to cover. This is not about protein. This is not. We want to meet a certain kilocalorie consumption, but we also want to meet, you know, our protein needs, but also our micronutrient needs, which we tend to lack a lot, particularly because we don't eat enough vegetables and fruits. This is the kind of a healthy diet that you see here. This is, if you're interested, you can examine it a little bit further, but as you can see, most of the kilocalories would still come from whole grains, and this is something quite important. You see here also some thresholds. Some thresholds here that are recommended quantities to be eaten. So you can actually see, you know, for example, vegetables, 300 grams per day. That's about, in American terms, that's about half a pound per day. Remember, eat your veggies, huh? Half a pound per day. Okay. Then we have dairy foods and all the others. But what you can see here is as I said, displayed in reality just shows you roughly how you should be trying to consume. Then we have the food systems boundaries. This is the typical, quite an important diagram that came from the original publication by Johan Rockström on the planetary boundaries. Now, what you see here is the original diagram had less planetary boundaries. Now we are dealing with 9 planetary boundaries. And you can see here that in the dotted lines, the food systems contribution, like here, these are the food systems contributions, and you can see which ones have been exceeded. The ones in red or orange have already been exceeded. So you can see, for example, for pesticides, we've already passed the safe amounts, and it's mostly coming from the food system. For others, it's a little bit different. So we want to actually come down and revert these patterns and try to find a way of keeping within this inner circle. That's what we need to try. Why do we want to do that? To ensure that the biosphere, to ensure that biogeochemical cycles keep operating as they should. If we trespass some of these, then it would be really, really hard to come back, or it will be incredibly expensive. So we need to try to do this in as better way as possible. I go back to justice in the food system because, there's some tacit elements that are rarely taken into account. In many cases, people frame this as the right to food. Everybody should have equal access to healthy, nutritious food, and at a cost that most people can afford. And this is something that is particularly difficult to obtain in a food system. Sometimes it's a function of the food environment that we don't have enough places where people can actually purchase. Sometimes it's an issue of demand and supply that, we're not producing enough, so the prices are incredibly high, so the poor cannot access. And it's something that we need to try to get to remedy. At the same time, it's very difficult. It's really important to actually try to deal with justice because there is also a tremendous lack of accountability in the system. If you leave it all to big food companies, you will end up with a lot of ultra-processed foods, with a lot of junk and lots of Cheetos. So we need to actually come back and work as society to really try to remedy, the roles and responsibilities in the food system. And that's why it's so important to really start putting justice at the center of the conversation. Now, modeling an EAT-Lancet aligned future. And this is where we go into how we did this. And we Cornell were leading this component, which was one of the most visible components of this forthcoming report. So we wanted to assess the consequences of what would happen if everybody ate an EAT-Lancet diet. What would be the consequences? Could we actually, would that be enough to get us within planetary boundaries, or do we need other actions? But then what would be then the role of agricultural productivity? What would happen if we could reduce food loss and waste, which for some things, we're talking about between 35 and 50% of some food groups that get lost as food loss and waste. Sometimes it's at the farm level, sometimes it's post-consumer, it's that chicken that you didn't eat for a variety of reasons that you left in the fridge. And then we wanted to actually also examine, well, if we wanted to have a really ambitious greenhouse gas mitigation target, could the food system deliver more than what the mitigation potential coming from the changes in diets would give us? So that was important just to see how we could actually create a food system compatible with a 1.5 degree of warming. That hadn't been examined very much. And we wanted results in terms of, the planetary boundaries, these environmental parameters that I showed, the fruit production quantities, labor, and affordability. Why labor? Because, in many cases, if you're going to contract a sector, suppose that all of a sudden, the EAT-Lancet scenario tells us that we should consume, 30% less beef. Well, that implies a contraction of the sector that will have ramifications into labor. People will have to try to do something different, etc. And if we want this to fly, we need to convince the finance ministers, the planning ministers, that, there's options for people that are going to be exposed to these potential changes. So, it's not just the science, but if we really want to create this sustainable food systems transformations, there need to be plans for how do we reallocate labor. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how complex and what a real exercise in herding cats this can become when you see all the teams that are involved just in the modeling. We were dealing with about 40 people in total from all these different agencies. These are all the models that are run when you run, say, the IPCC climate change scenarios, or where you work for IPBES, the biodiversity assessments, etc. It's the same crowd. But, imagine everybody with their own models trying to run the same kinds of scenarios. Not all the models are equally good at all aspects. Some are great for land use change. Some are great for looking at the diet problems. Others have really good accounting of emissions. Others deal with water. So it was important to use these ensembles of models to really represent the whole problem, and also for the things that all of them did, to be able to look at what were the uncertainties. This helps us advance the science of modeling food systems at a global level. So, how are we doing it? Mike, do you want to take over here?
Sure, yeah. If you want to.
Yeah, just go for it.
So we'll see if I can continue enthralling as well as Mario was. But in principle, the way that we did this is when you're going to be running these things across a whole bunch of different models, you have to come up with protocols so that everyone is more or less running the same thing. Because if you don't, then when you try to compare the differences across the models, you don't know if it's because they did something different or if the model's different. And the goal of what we're trying to do with all this work is this change in an EAT-Lancet world is fundamentally very different than the current existing world. And so we wanted to get a sense of what would that food system in the future look like? And so each of these 10 models, as Mario was saying, represents the food system somewhat differently. And so if we think about it, each one of them gives us an idea of what this world might look like. And so we've run them across all 10 of them. Then we start to get kind of a range of possibilities that allows us to start thinking about potential implications, whether it's environmental consequences or whether there might be some social justice implications with prices, affordability, and labor. And so a lot of the work we did was making sure that all of the models understood the scenarios that we were running, and we ran 3. And what we focused on was then having a business as usual scenario, which was our counterfactual. So essentially we tried to project to 2050 where we think the world would look like if more or less things keep going the way they're going now. And so then that's our counterfactual to say, well, if we switched to a diet, if we change productivity, what would be the consequences of that from the counterfactual of where that didn't happen? And so a lot of work was done on building that business as usual scenario to make sure that we're pretty comfortable in having a representation to 2050. And then we did this where we added in the different components of the EAT-Lancet future, which is this different diet, increased productivity with more of a focus towards sustainable practices, reductions of food loss and waste, and then also thinking about, well, in a world where we're doing these types of changes, what would we be doing outside of the food system? It's crazy to think that we'd be making this effort to make the food system sustainable, and there's no efforts outside of the food system. And so that's the motivation behind also thinking about how these might be complementary with efforts towards mitigation. And so we looked at whether or not the efforts we might do to make a more sustainable food system might contribute to broader sustainable objectives, and where there might be some tensions. And so that we could start highlighting that, so we could start trying to inform the types of roadmaps that we need to do to try to make transitions towards more sustainable food systems. And then, because these are really powerful simulation tools, we could set up the scenarios in a way that we could decompose then what were the contributions of each of these different assumptions. So how much did the diet do? How much did carbon pricing do? How much did increased productivity? What did each of these things contribute on their own? And then in combination, were there complementarities? Sometimes you find out that, well, you can only do one thing once. And so there ends up being a bit of like overlap between some of these. So you don't get as much benefit when they're all combined as if you thought if you just added them up individually. So what did we use as the main building blocks for our business as usual? So similar to how we created the Lancet Future, we also then needed to define the business as usual to 2050. And so with that, we assumed that we continue to have conventional diets with the trends that we're seeing today, which is as incomes rise, that we start seeing a shift towards more Western diets, more consumption of animal source foods, more consumption of processed foods, and continuations of increasing challenges with obesity and overweight. We also realized that technologies are constantly being evolving. We're improving practices all the time, so that the technology in 2050 is not going to be the technology we have today. And so we use different types of projections in terms of where things are going. What are the yield rate increases that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades? What are the investments that we've been seeing in science and technology? This is all pre the last couple of months. So we might have to, if we were to think about this in terms of how we're changing our investment strategies with R&D, we might have a very different business as usual trajectory if we were to rerun this. But these are the types of things why we do scenarios, because there's so much uncertainty of how the future might unfold. We also then pull out projections for population and GDP, and then we think about like, what's the policy environment? One of the key aspects of these tools is that they're economic models of the global system, so they also include trade. But trade policy itself, as we've been learning in the last couple of weeks, can change. And so what we assume for trade policy can also have pretty big implications on the functioning of the food system. Then when we go to the Lancet diet, then as Mario was already saying, what we do is we then compare, contrasting that to the sort of conventional current diet, we go to a healthy diet. We look at a trend where we increase productivity above the trend that we're seeing today, and assuming that it's more geared towards increasing sustainability. So with the expectation then that means improved resource use efficiency, and that these technologies then are less geared towards sort of conventional carbon heavy technologies. Reduction of food loss and waste, consistent with sustainable development goals, and then as well with running in combination with scenarios that had previously been done for the IPCC around what it would take to achieve a 1.5 world. And that involves things like land use policies in terms of preventing deforestation, investments in afforestation, new energy technologies, renewables, and carbon taxes. All of this work is going to be coming out in a whole range of different types of outputs that will hopefully be coming out in the next couple of months to before the end of the year. So as Mario said, a lot of this work was based on the modeling chapter that's in the report itself, but we also then have 3 different studies that we're targeting to be published in different high impact journals. And we've been organizing a special issue with the Lancet Planetary Health, where we start using individual models to explore specific questions of uncertainty that we couldn't do across the whole ensemble. And as Mario was saying, each of these models have strengths and weaknesses. And so what we've done is we try to get different models to look at where their strengths are to try to illuminate where we can't possibly look at with across all 10 of them. So we've got different studies looking at getting a better sense of the broader potential consequences on the environment. We have different studies looking at what might happen with different changes with food loss and waste. If we eat more fruits and vegetables, that could increase food loss and waste because they're perishable. How do these sort of things go into tension? What would we need to do to manage that? Also, the possibility of circularity as a way of managing food loss and waste. And then looking similar to circularity, we're looking at like specific solutions, also looking at ways we can make these changes in the diet. One of the big weaknesses of EAT-Lancet is that we ask the question, what would happen if you ate this diet? We don't answer the question, how would we get to eat that diet? And so that's kind of what we're starting to try to unpack a little bit with some of these studies, but ultimately will really be about what will come after EAT-Lancet 2 really needs to be a focus more on the how do we get from A to B, which at the moment we have not been able to do. For just a bit of a sense of what some of the implications are, under a business as usual scenario with population moving towards about 9.6 billion by 2050, we are seeing increased agricultural production of about 37% compared to today. We wouldn't see within all of these changes a reduction of agricultural production compared to today, but substantial reductions compared to that business as usual counterfactual if we were to eat an EAT-Lancet diet, if we had a bit more increased productivity and reduced food loss waste, and a little bit more when we do with mitigation. What's interesting with mitigation is that we find that the food share of agriculture drops quite a bit when we start throwing in mitigation, because there becomes more of a competition between food and the bioeconomy, because there's so much need for biofuels, but bioplastics and other things like that in a world where we're trying to get down to 1.5. So other sectors outside of food start to need to look at how they use nature solutions to achieve those problems, to solve those problems. And so what we see here is it's both a reduction in production compared to the counterfactual of 2050, business as usual, but a reorientation of the food system and the agriculture and land use system, one that moves away from producing feeds for animals, and where then the food part becomes more for direct consumption to humans, and an increasing use from other sectors that start needing to use some of the resources to resolve different sustainability questions. If we look at this across different regions and sectors, what we can see is that not all regions are going to be impacted the same by these types of changes. We see that some regions are going to have substantial reductions compared to the starting point. So if we look here, US and Europe, the gray dot is the starting point 2020. The red dot is BAU, so that's our business usual projection to 2050. And then the bluish, purplish dot is what happens if we were to do EAT-Lancet. And so with some of these, we see like sub-Saharan Africa, there's still a large increase in production, whether we're looking at the business as usual or whether we're looking at the EAT-Lancet. It's a bit less, but it's still a substantial increase. Why is that? There's large projected population increase in Africa. There's going to be a large amount of income and economic growth in Africa. And so it would be expected that there's going to be continued increased growth. But what we see is in high-income countries where population growth is slowing or is already declining, and where there's already large problems with overconsumption, so US and Europe, which we have the little red box on, what we see is then that under an EAT-Lancet 2 world, this is one where we might see actual reductions in agricultural production. We don't need as much production to be able to satisfy the demand under this future. And so what are the implications of these things is actually really important, because they're going to be part of that sort of discussing with the Minister of Finance and planning. The types of implications and the political questions around these are very different. If what we're talking about is a reorientation and a little bit less growth, that's a much different story to tell to the Minister of Agriculture than, yeah, we actually need to reduce production in our country, our region. And as we've already had this, we often find then the story starts to become a bit, well, what's the trade question? Because maybe in high efficiency producing regions in Europe, maybe we should just be doing more trading. But that has real serious justice implications in terms of what that would mean for producers in low and middle income countries. Again, as I was saying earlier, a lot of what we're going to be seeing, there will be a reduction in the size, but the bigger stories really is the reorientation of the food system. So it's not just about the importance of other sectors outside of food, but within the food sector itself, as we reorient it away from animal source food production, we end up seeing large reductions in prices for animal source foods, but also large increases in prices for vegetable, fruits, and nuts. And this highlights one of the potential tensions in terms of achieving these things, because if the prices are going to increase for the foods that we need more of, then we probably will need to do additional investments to assure that we can actually make these types of diets truly accessible and affordable to everyone.
Yeah, just to say that these are the food groups.
Yeah, sorry. So on this one, we have the food groups of agriculture, ruminants, which are beef and lamb, non-ruminants, which are pork, poultry, dairy, vegetable, fruits, and nuts are VFN, oil seeds, sugarcane, and sugar, rice, wheat, and then other grains. But what we also see is one of the interesting things that we learned is because a lot of the things that we do currently are pretty inefficient from a resource use perspective, shifting towards healthier diets, we have the resources to produce a healthy diet for 9.6 billion by 2050 without increasing the cost of that diet. Whether or not we will achieve that, of course, depends on how we do that. But by reallocating labor, land, water, and technology from current uses today to one that's geared more towards more sustainable and healthy food, we can actually get more food using the same resources. So we can achieve it without raising the cost, which is one of the big questions that the first report was not able to answer because it didn't use economic models. So of course, it's a big leap to say that this shift will not raise cost, because as we see, it can raise the prices of vegetable, fruits, and nuts. In some regions, the affordability were more of a problem than in other regions. In fact, in high-income countries, shifting to a healthy diet today would be cheaper than eating what we do on average. But it does highlight that the resources are there, and so it's more a question of political will to make it happen. I'm going to quickly just highlight some interesting pieces from some of the environmental results. So what we see with the business as usual is basically across all of the dimensions that we looked at, land, emissions, water, nitrogen, phosphorus use, they're going to increase. And as Mario was already highlighted, in many cases, we're already outside of the safe operating space. So this is a very problematic picture to start with. And then what we've tried to looking at what all the different components. And one of the things that we found in the first report was that productivity, food loss, waste reduction, that they could do a lot for the environment. But one of the things that we find with economics is if you do those on their own, they basically do nothing because they lower the price of food, you increase consumption, and you basically net out on not having much of a benefit on the environment. It's only when you combine efficiency improvements with some sort of dietary or demand side adjustment that you start to see real gains on environmental outcomes. And so we could see here as well with the diet alone, we get some real benefits, but there are areas that we don't. Nitrogen and phosphorus use continue to be real problems. And why is that? Well, a lot of the things that we need in a healthy diet require lots of fertilizer. Nitrogen and phosphorus are used a lot by production of fruits and vegetables. And so if we need more fruits and vegetables, the diet itself may not help us that much. When we combine all three of those components, we make substantial benefits on land and emissions, a lot of that being driven by what we see from the diet shifts, but we start to see benefits from also the efficiency gains from productivity and reduction of food loss waste. And then we start to see real substantial gains on nitrogen and phosphorus use, even though we're still not in the safe space. And so when we then combine it with sort of more of a whole of society approach where we're also trying to affect, we see even better gains across the range of different outcomes. But one thing that we also see is that there might be tensions between some of these things. So if we want to try to reduce emissions, that might be more biofuels. It might mean then that we irrigate some of those biofuels. So there we might have a bit of an increase in water use. And so what we see here is that it's difficult to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously without having to have some level of trade-offs between them. But when we combine them, we start to get a lot more of what we want. And So I think here with a couple of like the key messages that we've had so far. So as Mario's already laid out and what some of the results highlight is the food is a major driver of problems in terms of our environment and sustainability. We still have massive amounts of inequality and injustice within food systems all over the world today. And trying to achieve these futures will require some form of finding a way to reduce those. The healthy diet itself is quite compatible with a range of different traditional diets. It's sometimes talked about as like a diet that everyone has to do, but it's just basically a food-based dietary guideline. It's saying you should have this amount of fruits and vegetables, not what fruits and vegetables you should have. And so there's a lot of different diets that are quite compatible with this. We see that shifting diets has a massive effect, and if we could achieve it, would be a huge contribution towards achieving our environmental and sustainability goals, but on its own will not get us all the way to where we need to, which means that we then need to be able to complement this with other interventions, investments, and policies to make sure that we achieve that. In fact, across the different dimensions that we looked at, even in combination with all of them, we still didn't achieve all of them, suggesting that we probably would need to have more investments on how do we manage water and fertilizer and pesticide use. And if you noticed or remember the first, that exploding radial figure that Mario showed, there were a lot more planetary boundaries than what we could model. So we were incapable of, we don't have the data to talk about novel entities with the modeling framework that we have. So it's entirely possible that we could have achieved all 5 and failed to achieve other ones that we just don't have the data and the modeling capability to touch on. I think here then one of the key other lessons that we've learned is the real importance of using a range of different modeling approaches and lenses. Adding economics to the EAT-Lancet analysis was really critical about being able to highlight more issues around rebound effects and trade-offs, and that these will have implications in terms of the fair access and use of resources and food moving into the future. And that overall sort of doing this in a more holistic fashion is going to be necessary, especially given that the size of the changes that this type of a future would suggest is going to require a lot of effort to build coalitions, to build the type of collective action that would be necessary. And hopefully future work was going to be a lot more about how do we do this as opposed to just what would be the consequences if we were able to do it. And I don't know, Mario, if you want to add anything else.
No, that's great. Yeah, this was just to give you a little bit of an insight into to this piece that's coming, and it will be highly it will have high visibility. So if you want to engage further or really work in this area, please do contact us. We're here. We run the tools. We have a whole team set up for this.
Thank you, Daniel and Mario. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion. If you're online, please type your question in. We'll try to get to that. Quick introduction to yourself and then ask your question as briefly as you can.
How's it going? I'm Jack.
Hi, Jack.
I'm a senior in goal development. I know there's been some controversies about Lancet 1.0 with respect to costs and also nutritional adequacy, especially for protein and micronutrients. How does Lancet 2.0 address these concerns? And also, do you think we're making a trade-off between human health and environmental goals by implementing this diet?
You want to give it a go?
Yeah. Do we want to just do one or? Okay.
That's how we believe it.
All right, cool. No, that's a really good question. So I think one of the challenges in terms of nutritional requirement is that there's so much of difficulty between consumption and intake. And so there's all sorts of things in terms of even like what nutrients you absorb based on what you're consuming. And how and what you're consuming them with, right? So there has been a lot of work in this round to try to do even more effort around modeling the different nutrient availability that would be from the diets. They've looked at different populations, different genders, age groups to highlight that, a 5-year-old has a very different nutritional requirement than does, say, a 50-year-old. And so there's been a lot of work that's been done to updating that. I mean, in the defense of EAT-Lancet 1, there was a lot of that work that happened as well. It just wasn't as well communicated. So it became a bit of, people attacked it on that, even though there were some, I think, real questions in terms of uncertainty around nutrient availability. So I think the language with this one is going to be one that's a little bit more open to recognizing that individually, you may need to deviate a little bit based on your own individual requirements, but recognizing that as in sort of any kind of food-based dietary guideline, this is more of sort of general rules or guidelines around that. In terms of balancing health and environment, I think one of the things here that the report, both the first one and the second one that we'll highlight, is that there are a lot of opportunities where you don't need to do a trade-off between those. So that eating healthier diets, doing more sustainable practices is both good for the environment and for health. But there are places where there are potential tensions, and I think that's one of the things that we are hopefully starting to look a little bit more into in terms of questioning that sort of like win-win framing, that it's in general that's true, but when you really start going to brass tacks on how you achieve that, there will be some potential tensions, and whether or not you prioritize health first over environment may determine like what steps you take between, what's the first steps you take trying to achieve something like that. And so we're still very early in that stage. So lots of opportunities to improve.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Yeah, and the criticism on nutritional adequacy this time was dealt with because in the first one, yeah, it's true that nutritional adequacy, particularly for pregnant women and for the elderly, was not well calculated. So this time around, there were specific provisions to ensure that groups that needed more nutrients could get them.
Yeah, go ahead. Hi, I'm Garrett Silverman. I'm a communication major, and I was curious about, I guess, communication often falls short in the renewable energy landscape. Critics of renewable energy often point to economic issues or disadvantages associated with adapting renewable energy. And clearly there are actually a lot of benefits of economic benefits of adopting renewable energy sourcing. It seems that the same thing goes for this. There's a lot of economic benefits as shown by your data. If we, I guess, adopt these new eating behaviors and diets. And so I'm curious, like what's missing when we're communicating about this? Is there, are we, how are the critics able to dictate the narrative a lot with this, that it's not economically feasible? Well, a lot of data, I guess, shows that it is.
Yeah, I was part of the first one as well, and it was just unbelievable the number of attacks that we got after the messages came out. And this was basically because most people thought that this was a diet study, and it was not a diet study. It was a lot of people focused on, wow, some people here are suggesting that we should actually cut meat in by half, and really, and that's what all the media picked. It didn't pick anything on the productivity increases that were fundamental, on the food loss and waste. The problem is with communications, once you get one big headline, it's really difficult to revert and really convince people that the message was a lot broader. So we got a lot of sectoral attacks, like the beef lobby, I remember I was supposed to give a keynote at the American Association of Animal Science, and I got de-invited, for example. I got de-invited from events, hate mail and everything. This time around, we're paying an enormous amount of effort in media training, in engaging with communicators way before the report gets launched, started giving them sneak peeks, etc., and really ensuring that we get a more balanced message for this to happen. Because, you know it better than anybody, you know. It's the make or break of reports like this.
Yeah.
Question here? Trying to squeeze in as many as we can.
My name is Lila. Thank you for your
Bye-bye.
presentation. Often in this class, we hear about 2050 as the end goal for a lot of these projects, but I sort of find it difficult to conceive of the journey or the pathway. And so I was wondering what your hopes are, and then also what you think a realistic expectation for like 10 or 15 years is.
Yeah, well, the 2050 one, I think it's basically a UN number that has been, so if you think it's hard to imagine 2050 now, imagine say 15 years ago when we were starting to do these things with a 2050 target and trying to talk to policymakers who are like, I don't care what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years. And so, yeah, it's, I think that's one of the things that's a bit of a challenge, because the changes that we're talking about in this time are enormous. And so it's not like we're talking about a minor change. Like if we look at the EAT-Lancet diet compared to what's currently consumed, it is a radical change. And so to imagine that you could achieve it in a year or two is completely unrealistic. Like individuals can consume it, but to imagine that we would do a complete shift towards it in a short period of time is very, very optimistic. And so in many cases, we use these because the models would not solve if we tried to achieve such a large change in a short period of time. And so we're almost pragmatically forced to do it slowly over decades so that we can actually get the change to solve. In terms of optimism and things like that, I honestly doubt we will ever eat an EAT-Lancet diet at a population wide. But I don't think we need to do that to have massive improvements on the environment and health. And so, you know, this is one way of improving the environmental and sustainability. It's not the only way, right? There are other technologies, there are other practices, there are other things that we did not consider in this report that will also almost certainly contribute to this. But what it highlights is that if we could eat a healthier diet, we wouldn't have to do as much of the other stuff. And so we wouldn't have to do as much radical technologies that maybe we will have to do other trade-offs and that we'd be uncomfortable with if we had to do that geoengineering of the environment and other things like that. I think we're already seeing trends of people being more and more interested in terms of how their diet affects their health. Increasing understanding of the negative consequences of what we eat are becoming available, and I think people are starting to adjust. Can we get to 25% of the way towards an EAT-Lancet diet in say like 10 years? Maybe. I mean, I think that seems like something that we could certainly do. We already see in the United States, there isn't an increase in per capita consumption of red meat since 1990. And so this is like a story we keep talking about, meat consumption is going up, but red meat consumption in the US has been flat on a per capita basis since 1990. It's actually gone down a little bit. And so what's that mean? That means that potentially that as these messages start to get in, that people will start adapting to it, and then the markets will hopefully start to also then supply what people want. And there's a lot of space then for policy to try to make that happen in a more coherent fashion. And so I think I'm optimistic that we can make progress in that direction, and we don't need to go all the way there to still see positive benefits on the health and the environment.
Yeah, and also just in Europe, yeah, we already see increases in the consumption of red meat per capita, for example. But the key difference here is that, you know, the changes in diet are all behavioral. So we need a lot of, we need to study much more this area, how to actually make people eat better diets. What are going to be the triggers that will change that behavior? Because honestly, food loss and waste and productivity increases are both technological solutions, but it's really tricky to deal with that behavior aspect.
Respectful. One more question. Yes, after that.
Okay, as you were just saying, like how it would take like,
Speak a little bit louder.
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Saying how it's like a very slow progression. Like if you were to like start small with it, like what communities specifically would you like target to like try to work with to see like these like increases in productivity while also trying to like implement the diet like in the global south or like in like industrial agricultural or yeah.
Did you get the question?
Um,
I think it's what can you do now?
Yeah, so what are the the steps that we can do at the moment, right? So I think, so there's things that you can do in your individual life in terms of trying to align your actions around the things that you value, right? So I think it's always helpful to sort of think about what are the things that you really care about and what's important to you in terms of like, what are your values? And you can try to align then your actions around that. So if you want to reduce emissions, there's a lot of things you can do about like, what are the things that I do that have higher emissions and I can change so that align with that. The challenge though is from going from the individual to actually scale. And I think one of the things that we have to then be cognizant of is obviously if all of us make changes, that will have a big effect. If I by myself do something, it won't have much of effect other than I can align my life to be closer aligned to my values, which is important, right? So then what's really important then is how do you then communicate with your colleagues, friends, family, society? Because ultimately, if we don't start having these communications with our neighbors and with everyone, then all of this individual action will be uncoordinated. And the type of work we're doing needs to be coordinated. And so it's ultimately, it's a social and it's a political problem. And so we need to be more active in our communities, in our churches, in our schools, and we need to start talking about what are the things that we care about and how do we actuate collective action. And so I think to me, it's good that we can try to make our changes in our individual life, but I think the biggest thing that we can do is to become more socially and politically active in terms of trying to get people to align their actions with the types of changes that we would like to see happen.
Mario, Daniel, thank you for your fantastic work. When is it coming out?
Hopefully October.
October?
Yeah.
Look out for it in October. Thank you very much. Great job. Fantastic, fantastic.